2017 Hillman Colloquium series. My name is Dr. Joe Olney. I'm chair of the Department of Psychology. We appreciate you braving the bad weather. We promise to order up better weather tomorrow. A couple of housekeeping pieces, and then I'm going to turn this over to Dr. Bradley for the formal announcement of our speaker. Several things. If you are an undergraduate here as part of a class, we have vouchers that you will pick up at the conclusion of the talk. Those vouchers will be available to you out in the foyer. We also hope that you will hang around at the conclusion of the talk and have some goodies that will be available to all of us. In lieu of that, we appreciate if you would put your phones on silent as a courtesy to all those in attendance and to our honored speaker. So with that being said, I'll turn over the formal introduction to Dr. Keith Bradley.
Thank you, Dr. Olney. It is my pleasure to welcome Dr. Stephen Hayes as this year's Hillman Colloquium speaker. Dr. Hayes is the Nevada Foundation professor at the University of Nevada, Reno, has an inordinate number of publications and books, is a just incredibly talented scholar, and I think, for everyone in the psychology department that I've discussed the current colloquium with, we're so excited to have him, and his work has been incredibly influential in all of our work. I won't take much more time. Dr. Hayes has informed me he has nearly as many slides as he does publications. So with that, I will turn the time over to Dr. Hayes.
Well, thank you for that. I'm pleased to be here. I agreed to do this years ago, and then it came up, and I got, what? I'm going to Mississippi. Well, here I am. I've been in Mississippi before. I was 10 years at the University of North Carolina in Greensboro. And so I've never been to Hattiesburg before, but it's really been a pleasure so far. I'm looking forward to spending another day tomorrow with you. I was telling a story. One reason I came is I looked, and there's David Barlow, who's my mentor. And then a couple things down, I guess 2 years ago, Norm Anderson used to live in my house. I was a graduate student at Greensboro years ago, so I thought, okay, I guess I'm destined to go to southern Mississippi, and here I am. What I'd like to talk to you about today is something that I hope will be of relevance to all the applied programs, but maybe in some degree even the brain behavior folks, which is how we create more evidence-based applied psychology. And there's all different kind of ways that we're talking about how to do that. This is happening around the world, whether in the UK or whatever. How do we figure out what is the best way? And of course, that's part of what research is about, part of what the federal government, et cetera, have been funding. But there's been a change there. It's a big change. The area we lived through is that we had thought the way we make progress by collecting signs and symptoms, categorizing them into chunks, usually 5 out of 9 or 4 out of 7. You notice it's always 50% plus 1, because that way there's at least some overlap. We call them syndromes. And it did make progress of some sort. Bigger books. If you do the math, by 2050, there's more subsyndromes and subsyndromes than there are people in the United States. I'm not sure that's progressive, and I'm not 100% sure this is progressive. This is the list of evidence-based treatments at Division 12. I'm really glad that the first 4 are ACT. We thought of naming it AAA therapy, but it turns out acceptance is close enough. You get to the top of the list. And that's sweet, but then I wonder, are we really making progress? I wondered that from the beginning, and guess who now looks at that and says, no, that's not really a way to make progress. The NIMH now says that. You want to chase DSM? You got to go somewhere else. Well, I'm old enough to remember when Jerry Clareman, then head of NIMH, said, you want money? You have to put a DSM diagnosis on it. By the way, even the review panels are organized that way. That's all gone now in the form of research domain criteria of disorganizing things around different cognitive systems, motivational systems, social and arousal regulatory systems. And I do think that's a step forward. But it's not clear to me that this is kind of a common sense division, that it really is going to lead to a progressive science. And frankly, we can't afford another major failure. 30 years with the billions of dollars spent, we can't afford that. We have to show that this effort is producing better outcomes for human beings. And if we're not careful, I think that's where we're headed. I think I have an alternative, which I'd like to share with you. And it's one that's inside the acceptance and commitment therapy, or ACT work. Because ACT isn't just about a technology, or it's about a model. And not just about that, it's about how to develop a model. If you came to one of our conferences, you'd find it's called the Association for Contextual Behavioral Science. Contextual Behavioral Science, CBS, is a name for a strategy. That's what I want to share with you today, is what that strategy is. And it works for a lot of reasons, I believe. I think I can convince you that it works. The strategy, that is, it's one that could be adopted, whether or not you are particularly interested in ACT or psychological flexibility. You could adopt some of these methods. You probably know, if you're close to CBT in any way, or clinical in any way, you've probably heard the third wave of CBT, third wave of behavior therapy, is a term I used in my presidential address for the Association for Behavioral and Cognitive Therapy, published in 2004. And ACT, acceptance and commitment theory, is part of that, along with metacognitive therapy, mindfulness-based, or DBT, or behavioral activation. There's got a whole fruit nut seed mix of new methods. But really what's inside that, I think, is something else. It's a vision for how to create progress, which is really an old vision, that's a revitalized vision, that we're going to do it by looking at evidence-based processes linked to evidence-based procedures that help with the problems and promote the prosperity of people. And if you can figure out a way to get more P's in that sentence, let me know, because I'm trying to get the most P's per word. But what it means we're going to do is we're going to focus on processes that are measurable. That's easy. Changeable, that's not exactly easy. And changeable in a way that is precise and has broad scope, applies to many things, in depth, connects across levels of analysis. Nothing the brain says that behavior doesn't say the same thing. Nothing that we see in social development that isn't reflected in some way, psychological development, etc. And these processes should relate to moderation. Who should we be doing these things with? And especially mediation linked to components. We need to be able to manipulate the processes, and when we do, they're functionally important pathways to outcome. Because we have too much history of processes that we can measure. We can change them. When you change them, they go toxic. For example, praise kids, no matter what they do, their self-esteem will go up. But then the natural correlation between self-esteem and outcomes goes down. You end up with violent, non-accomplishing, high self-esteem children, which nobody asked us to produce. We were very successful at it. But the society didn't particularly need that help from us. But it was because we picked a process that wasn't manipulable, or when it wasn't reliable in traditional outcomes. And we personalized care, across physical medicine, but also behavioral health care, mental health care. We want to be able to fit what we're doing to the needs of people, individuals. They're not little cubby holes to have things shoved in them. People are not walking syndromes. They're human beings. And by the time in the DSM you got 65% comorbidity, that's not comorbidity, that's a bad diagnostic system. And so you need to figure out a way to do something that's more like functional analysis, but not just contingencies. I think other things have to be added. So that's reason one, I think. Maybe what I have to say here might be of some use to you, even if you don't care at all about flexibility or ACT, which is focus on process, but the kind I mean, the kind I just said, the kind you can measure, change, and when you change them, they're functionally important. I said that a while back, 2004. It's a core part of that paper. It isn't ACT uber alles, or I'm right. We're trying to put something in CBT that's more process focused, and that takes the best of our traditions and channels them that way. When you do that, then you have changeable processes that you can use to accomplish ends, just like bricks in a building. But it could be bricks on a walkway, bricks in a tool shed. You can use them for different things, and so people need different things from us. It isn't just, OCD or when they, depression. Go, I want to have better relationships. I want my business to succeed. By the way, peace of mind's important to me, or I want to know how to raise my kids. And so they have to be able to go wherever we can go. That's a picture of me. I told the story to the students earlier of hitting bottom in my own panic disorder years ago, which is kind of where ACT started. And I screamed a scream of desperation that I did 3 times in my life. Once when I was being crushed by a machine at work, once at that moment at the bottom of my panic disorder history, and once during the TED Talk 30 years later to explain it. I'm never going to do it again. I'm going to hear it, go listen to the TED Talk, that's the link. But the point of showing it to you is, reason number 2 is, it never lost me. And it's important that we keep focused on what's important, and it's really, let's build out our psychology on things that meet normal people's needs. I think part of what we've done in applied psychology, we've been too interested in psychopathology, and that's them. Go look in the mirror. That's the person we're talking about. And not just because you're weird, but because you're human. And if we can't speak to human beings, we don't deserve the departments we get, the university support we get, the grants we get, in my way of thinking. And so there's something in there of just asking some of these basic questions, like, why is it so hard to be a human being? Now, I want to talk a little bit about the model. It'll be easier to understand the model if you think of the behavioral tradition more as a wing of evolution science. Skinner argued that. Evolutionists didn't like it. Mostly they rejected that idea. But we're back again, and we're still singing that song. I'm working mostly with evolutionary biologists nowadays, people like David Sloan Wilson and others. But here's why. Because evolution has broken out of that idea that just genes made you do it. Why? Because the Human Genome Project has disproven that. We now know that's false. Because we've got full genomic analyses of 250,000 people. You know how many genes are involved in your height? 720, and they're still counting. So phenotypes don't come directly out of genes, they come out of gene systems, and not just that, they're regulated by genetic processes that turn them on or off, but not just that. That's regulated by environment behavior. Cells are systems for turning environment behavior into biology. That's what they're for. That's how they work. That's how they evolve. But evolution, in a larger sense, is something we should all keep track of, I think, because you can take the same principles, best established theory in all the life sciences, regardless of what the politicians say. No, it doesn't mean you're descended from monkeys or pigs. No, what it means is that we're going to track things based on variation. You always do what you've always done. You always get what you've always got. Mom's baby was absolutely right. You got to do things differently in order to have things move forward. And then you got to be able to recognize what's successful or not. Now, when you're dealing with genetic evolution and life and death will recognize that. When you're evolving on purpose, you need to be able to focus on evolving towards what? When you're dealing with cultures or a department of psychology or your own peace of mind, evolve towards what is an important question. And you got to retain the ones that work. If you don't practice it, you lose it. Don't use it, you lose it. And there are systems, of course, in genetic evolution to retain those gains, but in behavioral and cultural evolution, there are systems too. Learning is a method, as a way of talking about some of those systems, how it's retained. And we can build out on that. And if you're going to evolve on purpose, you've got to care about context. Not a good idea to put on a zebra suit in a lion park. Do it on your parade, you're cool. Not quite there. Well, if you're going to evolve on purpose, you've got to open your eyes and look and see what the hell's around you and within you as to what would really fit you and the situation you're in. I'm reminded of a story back in the day when we were doing a assertiveness training. I lived in North Carolina, and Rosemary Nelson, my colleague, said, we don't do assertiveness training here. We do Southern assertion. Turns out Southern assertion, if you're a female, was getting that person to do that person to change that person to change that person. And she was brilliant at it. You know what I'm talking about? You don't go directly to some big old dude and say, you're in that thing, you need to listen to me. You know, you might get punched. I hope it's changed. But you know what I'm talking about. You got to look at context. And so sometimes, you know, the cultural context requires that we do things in different ways when we want to make things happen. And that's true clinically as well. You got to know about the dimension. I've already mentioned a couple, you know, genetics, epigenetics. But there's also language and cognition, culture, the behavior itself. You can divide it up different ways. But you really need a good theory to tell us, are we looking at emotional development? Are we looking at cognitive development? Are we looking at overt behavioral development? And what are we looking at? And really fit that together as the one whole thing. One of the things I think we've forgotten as psychologists too much, to our detriment, is that we are one whole person. And for example, if you're working with somebody, find out what they're eating, find out whether or not they sleep. You know, there's a whole lot of things fit together. ADHD kids, they don't sleep very much. Have you noticed? Just go look at the data. You know, no wonder speed is helping them. The speed helps me when I haven't slept, you know. So you need to look at whole people, and this reminds us, because evolution is multidimensional, it's also multi-level. It's multi-level. We now know that, you know, selection can operate at the level of a band or a collective. Cooperation probably came because we evolved as small bands and troops. Cooperation pays off because of that. The old idea that it's simply inclusive fitness linked to genes pretty much has been mathematically and I think experimentally proved is not true. The only thing I really need coming out of this is be sensitive to the level you care about. Like if you're an administrator, we're talking about getting the metrics of how well faculty are doing. Don't just reward faculty for being productive and having big impact scores. Make sure that they're good citizens in your group, or you're going to get one unhealthy environment where you're just rewarding one level and you're blowing up another level because you're getting selfish people by doing that level. Same thing can happen in couples. Same things can happen within you. Don't just feed part of your repertoire. You're a whole person. There's many things. If you're just feeding one thing, that actually links to the kind of stuff we do in ACT. So the reading number 3 is, if you're going to organize processes, you need to put them in models. You're going to put them in models. Get some good theories, and one I'd recommend to you that's pretty darn good, that really will apply most places, is think about these things in terms of those 6 processes: variation, selection, retention, and context at the right dimension and level. Why? Because it's proven more. I mean, you just read Science Magazine, just pick anything. You're not going to see a lot of psychology there, but you're going to see a heck of a lot of work on epigenetics, genetics, and the rest. Evolution is alive and well in the sciences, and we need to catch up. So, what are the big restrictions on variation? Well, there are 2. When I started this journey in the 80s, after that moment on the carpet floor at 2 in the morning when I realized I'm not having a heart attack, I'm just having another panic attack. And I decided no more of that. Enough is enough. And I started looking at what is restricted in variation. Well, 2 big ones that have turned out to be pretty much so. One is avoidance. If you avoid it, you're not in contact with the things that will evolve systems. We know that just from animal models. Avoidance restricts your repertoire. The other one is excessive rules. And I've done work in the early 80s. Behavioral folks have been doing it. If you give even the simplest rule to human beings, suddenly they become very insensitive to the things that actually happen by experience. I mean, you can put a human being in front of something, tell them, if you do this, you'll get that, and they'll go for like hours and hours and hours in a way that a dog or a cat would never be so stupid to do if it didn't pay off. And it isn't just hours and hours. I mean, think about the last fight you had with your spouse, and I bet you knew in the back of your head, you should just shut up. But somehow or another it seemed, but just one more thing. It seemed important to say that, just one more thing, even though you know that's not going to work. Stop. You know what I'm talking about? We're insensitive. She's not being fair with me. Mom, thank your mind for that thought and shut. It's hard when you have a rule about fairness and how it should be. You know, the single most common fight in kindergarten, you'd think it was, you're taking my toy. No. If you've driven a long trip in a station wagon, have kids in the back, you know the answer to this question. The single most common fight is, who's right? That's not right. That's not good. I bet you if you go into your department meetings, you can still hear them. Excessive rule following. It doesn't take highly brainiac. We're talking 5 and 6-year-olds already got the disease. Never mind our full professors. They put them together, that's about the worst combo you can get, and it's easy to put it together. The last time you've ever been betrayed at something like in love, I bet you had the thought, I'm never going to let myself be so vulnerable again. In other words, because I really want intimacy, and I got betrayed, I'll just not try to have intimacy anymore. Because if you're not going to let somebody, if you're not going to let yourself be vulnerable, that's not intimacy, that's something else. So our brain doesn't know how to do what the whole of us wants to do. And it will tell us to avoid until it's over. 65% of the suicide notes say, when I'm dead, I don't feel bad, or somebody else will know that they did me wrong. Both of those things might be true, but it has a small side effect. So they're not going to come back and say, whoops, that was a mistake. We can so buy into this avoidance move that even suicide doesn't happen in 3-year-olds, it happens in 6-year-olds. Suicide happens in 6-year-olds. You don't have to be very cognitively advanced to think, if I was dead, I wouldn't hurt so much. So, what are those rules? And that combination, because that's what put me all the way down in my spiral into being on the carpeted floor at 2 in the morning. I would figure that out. And I didn't have a good answer for that. What are rules? I could give examples of verbal rules, but if you can only give examples, it means you don't understand it. It was clear to me that this was evolutionarily new. The dogs and cats and pigeons outside the window are not dealing with rule guard behavior, but we are. What is that? Here's a very, very small skill, which is where we started our work in relational frame theory. If a baby knows that that thing is called an apple, and then you say, give me an apple, they'll be able to orient towards the apple and give it to you. 12 months old, 12-month-old baby, do that. Could you make a sound, any sound?
Woo!
Okay, see this? Woo! Here, hold that. Woo! Woo! Of course you would do that. You would do that, wouldn't you? I think that you would do that, and to jump ahead, I got a secret. I think you would do that even without language because of the kind of monkey we are. There's the kind of tribal group that we are. How could I make that case to you? Well, here's the case, two things. Babies will reward cooperation. That little baby has Honey Nut Cheerios right there. She's a pretty small baby. There's an actual study, a picture from it. Two puppets interacting. One's a mean puppet, one's a cooperative puppet. The mean puppet comes and wants one of her Honey Nut Cheerios. She's not giving that puppet a Honey Nut Cheerio. The cooperative puppet comes over. She's feeding him her precious Honey Nut Cheerios. They're gone. She's going to feed him. A baby. If you go forward and are playing with a baby, you've done this, and you're playing with toys, they're all messy on the ground, and then it's cleanup time. And you start picking up the toys and put them in the box. Cleanup time, time to put the toys away. You've done that with your little ones. If you point at a toy, the baby will pick it up, look at you, and try to put it in the box, right? Now, if another adult comes in, gets down, brand new, just walks in, points at the toy, baby picks it up, gives you the toy. Okay, so here's what I'm saying. Even babies, pre-verbal, understand something about intentionality. They have basic nonverbal theory of mind skills, and they will reward cooperation. That's what you just did. This is not highfalutin. This does not take a lot of language and cognition to do this. Okay? But here's the deal. This little thing here, I'm going backwards, of if you know the name for it, if I say it, you give it to me. No non-human animals have ever been shown to do it. Not with replication. There's one pinniped that maybe did it. Schusterman's lab. But he's dead, and Rio the sea lion is dead, and it was never replicated, and they had errors in it, and we pointed out the errors, and no one's been able to replicate it, and what he did is he changed the procedure. And by the way, it was 1 out of 3 animals, so I don't believe it. At Yerkes, the so-called language trained chimps, you flip it around to this task that your 12-month-old can do, and the chimps go, huh? You know, they don't do, boop, give it. Your baby does. Here's the thing, you don't do that, you don't develop language. We got the data showing it. You don't do that, you never will be able to develop what we and I are doing right now. It's a pivotal skill, and it doesn't get built out properly. Here's what I think, a way to say it. Language, look, we've had a 300-year journey down the idea that language has something to do with learned associations. The cognitivists kind of gave up on that and went to associations inside the meat of the brain or the meat of the computer, but that's cheating, because those aren't psychological processes. Yes, of course, your brain is connected. Yes, of course, the wires go together. Don't call that association. That's not association the way we mean it. No one has been able to make associative models work with language and cognition. We have a 300-year effort to do it. Why? It's the wrong answer. It's not learned associations, it's learned relations. Your relation, you did socially for me. Learn it in 1, derive it in 2. That would happen even without human language, I believe, because we're the cooperative primates. It's never been the case that Jane Goodall saw a log on the ground with a chimp pick up one end and a chimp pick the other end and move the log. Never happened. They do cooperation, but not at these high level. You put toddlers in a room, they'll cooperate. You put that baby in there, they'll reward cooperation. So my point here, here's what my point is. This is 30 years of work. I summarized it in a ditty, relational frame theory down to 4 lines. Learn it in 1, derive it in 2. You just did it for me, thank you very much. Put it into networks that then change what we do. Those are called relational frames. Those are relational frame theories. It's a learned process of relating that's built on social relationships, turn-taking between speakers and listeners, but then builds out in another way. Now, I'm making you all seasick by jumping around my slides, but suppose that's a family. It is, actually. Who's related to who? Well, you can't exactly tell. People of different ethnicities and races are in there. I mean, Fred might be married to George. 2 people living in Hattiesburg may be distant cousins, and somebody who lives in San Francisco and Mississippi may be in a long-distance marriage. There may be an aunt who's younger than her niece. You can't do it just by appearance, physical location, or temporal location, and those are the 3 things on which association is built, right? Similarity, contiguity, and time and place. But there are relationships there. And if you know all those people, you would know every single one. How everyone relates to every other one. You with me on this? And it'd be an incredibly high number. I just did my 23andMe thing. Have you done that thing? It comes back and says, you have 1,400 relatives in the 23andMe. Wow, 1,400. I did the math. You know how many digits you need to write the number to describe 1,400 people in all the pairwise relationships? It's 350,000 digits. It takes 200 pages to write down the number. It would take the rest of your life to describe it. Even a group like this would probably take us a week to fully unpack all the possible. It would take a lot. It would take a lot. But you can do it. Of course, if you know how they're all related, you can do it with your family, can't you? So it's incredibly, this idea of, it's not association, but learned relation. I think we have scaled socially the idea of social relationships into our communication system. If I ask you what a metronome means, the part of your brain that's involved in speaking just lit up. Because we have the listening and speaking integrated into a single system, and we're the only animal that does that. Well, that's great, right? That's wonderful. Well, not completely. It means anywhere you go, you can remember anything that ever painful happened to you. If you had a car accident, and your brother died in the car accident, and you were injured, and you're still dealing with the physical after effects of it, just the word car may be enough to have your blood drain out of your body. You with me on this? At the height of my panic disorder, if you said panic, I got scared. If you said anxiety, it was terrifying. If you said relaxation, it would make me nervous. If you said motion, I was looking for where the door was. It was hard to be a clinical psychologist. You couldn't talk about anything. It had to do with emotion, because all roads lead to Rome. Because I'm listening to the relaxation tapes. Why? Because I don't want to be anxious. I look at the tape, it reminds me of being anxious. Anybody ever heard of relaxation-induced panic? Any anxiety disorder workers in here? Because it's bidirectional, it doesn't go in one. You learn it in one, you derive it in 2. I like bluegrass music occasionally, just for some things. I used to play it. My second marriage, when it ended, I was so sad. I was just going to listen to some bluegrass. I never listened to bluegrass. I'm a trance guy, but a punk rock guy. But I listened, and it was soothing for about 3 days. And then I put on the bluegrass and because it would take me. And people have shown this, that suppression now reminds you of the very thing. Now these learn it in 1, derive it in 2, because it breaks free of form. There's nothing between boo and this that puts it together. Nothing. Yeah, language might include some onomatopoeias and stuff, but mostly it's not, right? You can actually break it completely free of form. A 3-year-old has a really hard time picking between a nickel and a dime. They want the nickel. It's bigger. A 6-year-old does not have a hard time at all. They want the dime because it's bigger. And you can arrange that in the lab in such a way they've never spent the dime. They never used the dime. They still want the dime. It's bigger. Yeah, well, the dime can be bigger. No matter how much success you've had, you can be Donald Trump and it's not enough. I should have had so much more. You could do it. Why not? And we do it. So that is good in a way because we can use it for problem solving. You got the equivalent of a nickel that you spent for candy, you want that dime. You know something about how to plant food and grow a lot, but over here to have so much more, you want to do it that way. That's good. It's called problem solving. Yeah, but as soon as you do that, how are you going to avoid doing this? You can always say good or bad. Here you go. Anxiety, happy, sad. My 93-year-old mother died 2 years ago. I was there, put my hands on her as her feet turned black. As it sped up, she had pneumonia. As her breaths spaced out. And then finally they come to a long one, and then one more breath, and then a long one, and then there wasn't another breath. Sad, bad? You just said sad, bad? Really? If somebody dies, within 2 weeks, if your friend's got tranks and you're still sad, they want to give you the tranks. The new DSM says that they can do it. How far out from being a human being are we really willing to go inside sad, bad? Sad is not bad. Sad is sad. You with me on this? But that's not what the mind does. The mind goes, sad, bad, problem solving, get rid of. Eat tranquilizer. Come on. Come on. Your freaking mother died. So there's something anti-life inside just letting your brain run you, just letting language run you. It'll squeeze the life out of you. That's why when you were betrayed, and I'll never be vulnerable again. Okay, well that means you never love again. That's too high a cost. And you're wiser than that, but your problem-solving part of you is not wiser than that. It's just a little learn it in one, derive it in two. So why RFT matters to that community, and the reason here that I think does underlie, whatever you're going to do, put it into a sensible model, show that you can manipulate and change and produce good outcomes, but then do the basic analysis of it. Don't just let it stay there as rules. Contingency specifying. So what's specifying mean? And we spent the time to unpack. I did 3 randomized trials of ENACT, coming up off that floor I showed you at the bottom, from 1982 to 1985. I didn't do another one to 2002. And I'm a pretty productive guy, but I didn't want to just put a technology in the world. I wanted to put a model in the world that was linked to things we could understand and do something about. And I didn't understand human language, so relational frame theory and all that kind of stuff. And what does it say? Well, cognitive relations are learned. That means they won't be unlearned. You'll take learning from, who's my colleague here, teaches learning, and you'll never find the lecture on unlearning. There's extinction. That's not unlearning, that's inhibition. You can learn it again faster the next time. That means it's there to some degree. You with me on this? So if language is learned, it means it's never going to be unlearned, which means if you don't like something you think, you better get used to it because it's never going away. For the rest of your life, you'll be able to think that. And sometimes you will. When 9/11 happened, there were people in the corner calling for their mama before the building collapsed. You know they did. It never leaves your repertoire. It's broken free of form, so you can't even get it to be rationalized just by linking it to form. A nickel can be smaller than a dime. It means anything that you put together is something you want or something you don't want will be there regardless of the form. And that's cool, but it's also a burden. It started as cooperation, but turned into problem solving, which means you have a powerful pull to turn that repertoire back on yourself and turn your life into a problem to be solved. As soon as you do that, you're in trouble. Sad. You just did it. You can solve that problem. You suppress enough, you drink enough, you dissociate enough, you can solve that problem. It'll ruin your life, but you can solve that problem. You avoid enough, you stay away from places where you're vulnerable, where you care. Because guess what? We hurt where we care. So, once you've turned it into a problem to be solved instead of a process to be experienced, it can only take you so far. Problem solving is important, figuring out how to get a degree or write your term paper. I suggest to you that it's not so important when you're trying to look at something like peace of mind or what it takes to really love. We need to put that mind of ours, that relational learning tool of ours, on a leash. Because it's not the whole of us, and it's not our master. They may look like the Wizard of Oz head, giving commandments when we're sitting alone at 2 in the morning. But really it's just a part of us. It's a repertoire that's there for a purpose. And so psychological flexibility, what is inside ACT, has these components. And don't forget the evolutionary process. I'm going to link it back to it. To open up repertoires that have been squeezed down by this problem-solving engine, we're going to learn to look at language the more way you look at it if you were meditating or if you were looking at an object from far away. With an attitude of curiosity, hey, I'm thinking that thought again. I remember that thought. I'm no good and I'm unlovable. Thank you, mind. Now, what do I want to do? Where you have a little bit of gap in there for human intentionality and purpose to come in, not just the automatic push-pull, click-click of these networks of cognitive relations. And that you've opened up to the whole of you. I told the story earlier, don't have time to do it here, but the students know what I'm thinking right now about the boy under the bed. If you're going to talk earlier. As you open up, you don't just open up to pain, you open up to purpose. So diffusion, which is our name for looking at thoughts with an attitude of dispassionate curiosity. Acceptance, which is our name for opening up to emotion. It's still in our English language. Here, will you accept this? It means to receive. This is to receive a gift. The pain of sadness when your mother dies is a gift to you. Of course you know that. And I would have paid $10,000, $100,000 to sit there and watch my mama die. You with me on this? Not because I wanted to watch my mama die, but because I needed to be there. Because that's what love is about. You with me on this? And yeah, that was sad and holy. And then you need to show up into life consciously. That means being able to attend flexibly to what's present in a way that feeds your interests. Flexibly, fluidly, voluntarily. It doesn't just mean being in the present. We're here all the time in the present. It doesn't just mean attending. My 11-year-old attends to Minecraft. You could fire a gun off behind his head and it wouldn't even startle. He's just loving Minecraft. No, I'm talking about contact with the present moment that's flexible, fluid, and voluntary, and touching this more spiritual, ineffable part of I here now am aware. I don't have time to unpack that, but relational framers have, and we can establish a sense of self in kids who don't have it. We can measure it, we can change it, because we have the basic science now as to where that integrated sense of consciousness comes from, at least a little of it. And then values. We need to connect with what these chosen qualities of being and doing that we want to put into our behavior and into our states of being, and build our habits of action around that. That's the psychological flexibility model. It has 6 things, but they're really all one thing. They're like 6 sides of a box, but if you pull off 2 sides of the box, it gets all wobbly. All 6 are needed. There are aspects, but there's one box. You with me on this? That's psychological flexibility. Now, when we finally did come back through randomized trials early in the 80s, see those little tiny things? And then right up here, I write the ACT book. Right there is my first randomized trial after all of that development. And then it's now every 12 days there's a randomized trial. We're going to pass 200 this year. And it's in every conceivable area. Behavioral health, addiction, you name it. Now I want to kind of do a flicker fusion thing. I'm going to blast through some data because I'm going to try to convince you that the psychological flexibility model actually is better than some things that are out there, like self-esteem or self-efficacy or the rest, even though they're important, they're reasonable, but they haven't been built the same way to be the kind of broad scope high precision concepts that I think flexibility is. Now you can look cross-sectionally and longitudinally in correlational studies. That's good, there's a place for that. And when you do that, you'll find that, for example, psychological flexibility scores, there's 20 different measures of it, and of these different aspects of measuring values or measuring diffusion or measuring acceptance. But they will predict most of the anxiety, mood, substance use disorders that we care about, at least to a degree in cross-sectional models. Pretty good. The more impressive one are these longitudinal models. This is Spinhoven in a study in behavior therapy, where he had, 2,300 people followed, it was in Holland, for, was it 4 years, with blind clinical interviews and taken psychological flexibility measures at each point. Psychological flexibility predicted, would you develop an anxiety and mood disorder if you didn't have one? If you had one, it predicted whether or not you'd have two. If you have one or you have two, it predicted whether or not you'd continue to have one. And it did so better than any of the other processes they measured. These components all kind of work together as we begin to get the assessment devices of each 6 things. The most mature area is chronic pain, where we have maybe 30 or 40 studies. It's really acted as almost a standard of care now in chronic pain. But as he walks through this, you're able to get up in longitudinal models to something pushing 30% of the variance in psychosocial outcomes accounted for by these earlier measures. And it mediates most of the things of interest. If you look at the components, if I just target assessment, if I just target values, if I just target flexible attention to the now, I just target awareness of thoughts, I just target this observer sense of self, I just target committed action, they work pretty well. This is a meta-analysis that we published out of my lab in 2012 showing that basically the components all, compared to different kind of conditions, work pretty well as components, and as you begin to combine them, like down here, these effect sizes start getting up into a large or very, very large range. It's in behavior therapy, you can read it. The more important one is treatment mediation. That's the one I pegged earlier. We want to be able to target the measure, the processes. When you move and you get good outcomes, okay? We have more mediational studies in CBS and ACT than any other approach, even CBT, and it's more consistent in outcomes. Everything from whether or not you're going to win at a sport event. We literally had people winning gold medals in Rio. I was there and watched them, who are ACT clients. Whether or not you can score points when you're on ice, if you're an NHL, whether or not you can lose weight or exercise or step up to the challenge of cancer, or I'm going to show you some examples. These are the meta-analyses just over the last 3 years, just of ACT. And if you scanned it, it's getting small, but you can see this is anxiety and affective disorders, chronic disease, chronic pain, substance use, binge eating. In other words, they're writing meta-analyses. Oh, all these different things linked to ACT. So we're getting big enough to be like that. So it's not just transdiagnostic, it's like transdiagnostic on steroids. Because what we're trying to do is figure out how the human mind works and how to deal with this restriction of variation and this inability to select and move towards what you really care about. If you get that down, it applies everywhere. Everywhere. Work, you name it, it applies. That's the claim. The technology is different. You can't do smoking the same way you do depression, but the model is the same. And that's an old vision. In fact, it was the original vision of behavior therapy. It's just we're back at it. This is an example of the kind of effect sizes you get. I think it's a pretty good one. 2015, a general one, 39 studies, about 2,000 participants. Wait list, a large effect. Treatment as usual, a large moderate. Comparison to other evidence-based methods, a small effect. But that's good. Small, positive effect, I'll take that. And the model works better. There's about 60 studies now of treatment mediation. We're getting now 3 or 4 or more a year minimum. And so far, across all the studies, if you just do an amount of nobody has an effect size measure for mediation, unfortunately. It's a problem. Statisticians haven't figured it out. But if you just look at percent of outcome mediated, well, some of you don't know what mediation is. I'm just explain what mediation is. You don't have to know the stat. Most of these are cross products of the coefficients. If you want to know the stat, I can show you where to go to read about that. But basically, it's if you move the process you think is important, that process then is shown not just to correlate, but to have a functionally important relationship to outcome. How you do that statistically, I don't want to spend seconds on it, but it's doable. And so it just means it's functionally important. The people who improve on this are the people who are going to improve going forward. And that's really important clinically. Why? You've got to be able to read whether or not you're making progress once you just measure the outcome. Because signs and symptoms of syndromes do a poorer job of predicting outcomes than psychological flexibility does. Because sometimes people change their symptoms suppressively. Sometimes they do it in an unhealthy way. I'm feeling better. Why? Just don't think about it. No, don't do that. It ain't gonna work. It's called thought suppression. I'll show you the data. You with me on this? Anybody work in the addictions? You ever heard of pink cloud and rosy glow? That's addiction folks talking about what I'm talking about right now. You can do things that look good that are unhealthy. Mediation takes that away. Here are the first 18 or 20 studies, just to show you, each of these little triangles is an effect size. One would mean it accounts for all of the direct effect on treatment once you put it in the mediator. This is for mediation, the dividing line for a large effect size, and you can see they all come in. And then look at the different areas: pain, smoking, dealing with epilepsy, diabetes, learning as a clinician how to do evidence-based treatments. I mean, it's really kind of an incredible range of things, and they all work as mediators. Averaging around 50% of the variance accounted for. I'm going to show you now a few studies, and my point is, when you get a model that really works, yeah, you can do some cool things clinically, but you can also give it away. Other people can use the model. We don't have to be grabby about it. This is not act uber alles. I don't care about act. What I care about is human progress. Take the process and put it inside what you're doing and figure out a way to help open up that repertoire, get people focused on what's important, and doing more of what works. If you could just do that, you've done a really important thing. And it's pretty close to the things that we already know in our culture. Now here's the deal. This is a study done at JCCP, Journal of Consulting and Clinical. It's out of Michelle Krask's lab, one of the best clinical researchers on the planet, in my opinion, comparing her methods with her students with our methods, supervised from 500 miles away by one of my graduate students. So we're really kind of, not invented here. We're doing that. We got one hand behind our back. This is her shop, her people, her study, her technology. And what happens? Well, in terms of psychological flexibility, we're up is what this is. Mixed anxiety disorders, about 130 of them, and they're all going to get exposure, but they're even going to do it inside a traditional CBT model, but best of breed, and interoceptive exposure. This is Barlow-Krask stuff, if you know that area. Or act, open up, feel your emotions, watch your thoughts, focus on your values-based exposure. You with me on this? Okay, that's the difference. Psychological flexibility measures, up is good, act does better than CBT. They both have exposure, they should. It's the right way to do it. Here's the actual blind clinical interviews. It's the best quality data in the whole study. 1 year follow-up. Same exact result from pre to post. From post to follow-up, more than a standard deviation, better outcomes. In her shop, with her methods. You show me another study like that, where you can beat gold standard by more than a standard deviation. Doesn't exist. But I know of. I'm sorry for the chest thumping. I'm sorry. But you show it to me. You show it to me and I'll stop chest thumping. There's something really important inside acceptance, diffusion, and values-based exposure that adds to what we had before, in my opinion. Because you can keep improving as you go forward. And now we know, in recent couple studies, that the effect even of this part, the CBT part, was mediated by psychological flexibility. It's just they didn't know it. Turns out that's true not just there with exposure, it's true in chronic pain. CBT for chronic pain. CBT for chronic pain sometimes will include things that directly contradict what we're trying to teach with ACT for chronic pain. Word for word go against the items where we try to measure flexibility. Nevertheless, Lance McCracken, a researcher at the University of London, has shown that if you compare acceptance to other things like social support or life control or affective distress, this is the effect size of acceptance of CBT for pain, mediating the outcomes of CBT for pain, accounting for almost 3/4 of the variance compared to things that are more used to accounting for 15 to 30% of the variance. So this process is everywhere. You're doing it already. If you're doing clinical work, you're doing it already. You're a humanist, you're an existentialist, you're an analyst, you're doing it already. You're a behaviorist, you're doing it already. You might as well know you're doing it. And then read it, and then try to move it. Because it's probably why. Something like cognitive reappraisal. Cognitive reappraisal. Turns out cognitive reappraisal linked to detect, challenge, dispute, and change in the sense of I'm no longer to think that wacko thing. Bad idea. That doesn't mediate outcomes. Linked to cognitive flexibility. Good idea. Does mediate outcomes. A thought record. Oh, look at my thoughts. That's already having positive effects. Beck called it distancing. The original name for ACT was comprehensive distancing. It sounded dissociative. We went to a better name. But our point is, being mindfully aware of your thoughts, that's cool. Trying to get Mr. Clean's magic eraser in your thoughts, bad idea. And I know you're not trying to do it if you're doing traditional CBT. I know that. But your clients don't necessarily know that. You just talk to people who've been through CBTs and they, I still have the thoughts. Well, of course you still have the thoughts. Your nervous system doesn't have a delete button. There's no minus button in your nervous system. But that's what they get reading the Red Book. Here's a few examples. By my clock, I got 10 minutes. I'm going to make it. Is that okay? Otherwise, get the hook. This is an intent to treat analysis, 2 studies, looking at rehospitalization, a total of 4 hours with chronically ill folks in the hospital, at the point at which they get, there enough that we can talk to them 45 minutes, 4 sessions. And we follow them for a year. This is a survival curve. And you see, this is rehospitalization. These are chronically mentally ill. The average length of stay once they leave the hospital is something like 79 days. They're back in, right? But you get this nice effect here. Lasting a year out, it's still lasting, and it's fully mediated, go look at the study, by diffusion. People admitted to their symptoms more, and when they did, they stayed out of the hospital more. If you denied they had any symptoms, your likelihood of going back to the hospital is equal between the 2 conditions. It only work if you get this kind of thing, oh, I'm having very odd experiences. Now, what do I want to focus on in my life? That's healthy. You know the movie A Beautiful Mind? That. He's still psychotic. He's waving to the end of the movie, waving to the hallucinations in the back of the Karolinska as he gets the Nobel, right? Of course, that's Hollywood, but it's actually true. He was still suffering with psychotic symptoms. Most people who have psychosis will for the rest of their life. But that doesn't mean they can't have a life. This is a study on depression. There's 200 randomized trials. I'm grabbing about 6 or 7 just because I think they're cool. This is Ernst Bollmeyer's study, and the reason I picked it, it's large, that's nice, and it's a program on, living life to the fullest, which I think is kind of cool with people who have mild to moderate depression. Fully mediated outcomes by psychological flexibility. But he also looked at flourishing, because we don't want to just erase depression, we want to get people to live, right? You actually look at measures of flourishing, it's not always good. You can have outcomes. Some of the stuff my mentor, David Barlow's work. And panic goes down, actual involvement in life doesn't necessarily go on. That's bad, Dave. That's bad. You haven't finished. You're not just trying to erase anxiety. When you're dead, you don't have anxiety. That doesn't mean it's... Here's what happened. These are how many folks flourished by these measures of psychological, emotional, and social well-being. And you see a big jump in that compared to the control condition. That's been replicated in 2 or 3 studies. That values piece really helps remind people what you came here to do. I love this study. This is a randomized trial. It's published in JCCP, our best clinical journal, by Amy Zarling, with comparing ACT to the kind of supportive groups you get typically if you're a batterer. These are batterers. I wrote a blog about it called Perpetrators Are People Too. Don't be just shaming and blaming and wagging fingers and putting people in prison. And it's on that list, visit the prisoners, remember your religious traditions, for a freaking reason. Prisoners and perpetrators are people too. That doesn't mean I'm excusing the crime. No, but it means I'm going to walk inside their own mind and help them out when their primary way of dealing with pain is to batter. And here we get, these are measures of actual violence, partner, certified actual violence, a large effect size in a randomized trial of ACT. Here's the data that just came out 2 days ago, 3 days ago, 2 weeks ago, something, of the psychology of violence. Now, across the entire state of Iowa, the entire court system, all the batterers get put in, and they assign them to CBT and the Duluth model, which is essentially feminist training. You have to understand, that we're in a patriarchal society, that kind of stuff, which frankly can be a little shaming, in my opinion. I mean, I'm a feminist. I actually am. My daughter's was the public relations officer for the California Consortium of Domestic Violence Programs. I get that. Go read ladytroubles.com if you want to read my daughter's feminist rants. But the point is, stop the violence. All right? First big study there. Now we got it replicated with court adjudicated, and not voluntarily in this. The judge said they had to. And look at those difference in terms of actual charges over the next year, including domestic assault and any violent charge. 37% reduction in actual violence after they've gone through a court-required ACT program versus the CBT Duluth model. I know because of your work with schools and families that I put this in here because I went and looked. There's 6 trials of parent training from an ACT point of view, combining with other things, adding in it. Parents are more likely to do parent training, etc. If you do ACT, values really helps. But this is a nice little study combining triple P, positive parenting, with ACT with parents of children of acquired brain injury. There's another one with cerebral palsy. So 6 studies, but this I just picked 2. This is Brown et al. 2014-15 to put together these slides, because it's looking both at parent behavior and their stress and clients' problems, and the flexibility of the parent. And these are effect sizes so that you don't have to worry about what the metrics are. So a Cohen's D of 1 or whatever, and a large effect size is what a Cohen's D of 0.5. So parents are more able to cooperate and work together. They're less anguished, all this is significant, of course, less distressed, have fewer problems, and the Cohen's D of almost at 1 point. The kids have fewer problems, and the parents are more psychologically flexible, and what mediates all of that is the parents' psychological flexibility. You're emotionally avoidant, cognitively entangled, and not connected with your values, you yell at your kids. Or whatever. Kind of cool. This is a study done, I know some people here are interested in broader issues of health. This is a diabetes study done where we take American Diabetes Association approved protocols and we simply take the 6 hours of training that's required as a condition of care, squeeze it to 3 and put in ACT instead. There's a book out called The Diabetes Lifestyle or something like that. I'm an author on it. I wish I didn't have that title. It should have been called Mindful Way Through Diabetes. But anyway, our flexibility around diabetes goes way up, self-management goes way up, and then this is the kicker, the A1C scores, the percent that are in diabetic control, 50% 6 months later are in diabetic control as a result of squeezing down your training about how to deal with diabetes and squeezing up how to sit with the difficult thoughts and feelings and remind yourself of your values around diabetes. That's kind of cool. That would predict if it maintains an 80% reduction in loss of limb and blindness. I've taken some heat for this study, strong heat, really almost ad hominem attacks. This is not true, blah, blah, blah. It's been fully replicated 2 months ago in PLOS One, a large trial, much better done trial. So I encourage you to look at it, exactly the same outcomes. Appears to be real. You could have a whole lot of people not lose their sight or their feet if you just teach them to sit with the distress that will come when they look at those freaking numbers. And the training that we get when we go to the healthcare system, if you don't do this, you're going to go blind. Let's make it stop. My wife developed diabetes during pregnancy. It went away, thankfully. That's what they did to her. They threatened her with the health of our baby to make her behave. Dude, this is not a good idea. And it's so unkind and so unwise. Theoretically sensible moderation. We have several studies now looking at the moderators of ACT versus traditional CBT. ACT appears to be better with multi-problem patients and with more complex patients, simpler patients. CBT might be better. And then a recent study in terms of dropout, again by the CRAS group, just came out. ACT seems to be better for those who do not perceive having control over their internal anxiety states. Well, that's theoretically consistent. So I don't have to be ACT is always better. No, ACT is better when it's better. Let's find out. And that's the person-specific vision that I had earlier. That's the functional analysis tradition we want to get to. That's the process-based therapy when we put down the DSM that we want to get to. So stuff like this is just cool, in my point of view. And then here's a couple things reminding you that you're people too, if you're a clinician. Here's one, who's willing to use exposure? If you've ever done exposure work with anxiety, you know that's hard. It's emotionally hard. There's a nice study just came out a couple of, 2015, with a correlation of 0.3 of how flexible the clinicians are with how willing they are to recommend and to assign significant amounts of exposure to anxiety disorder clients. That's distressing. You don't want evidence-based care delivered based on the emotional openness of your therapist. You want it delivered based on your need. Well, get clinicians more emotionally open and you'll do it. This is a study we did, published in JCCP, showing that drug and alcohol counselors who sometimes have to say things like, well, there is methadone, even though they cleaned up maybe through 12-step, they have to, they'll say, I don't use drugs to treat drugs, that's right. Dude, look at the data. If your mother's a heroin addict, you'd rather have her on methadone than down on 4th Street. I just look at the data. So I'm sorry, suck it up. You got some work to do. You're here to serve others, not just to have them replicate your biography. All right, so we put them through an 2-day ACT workshop, then we treat them on the science of substance abuse, focused on agonists and antagonists. Get them on randomized trial. People in the ACT Plus education group, now they have 3 days of training, 2 on ACT, 1 day on the science of substance abuse. They're more likely to say, this is going to be hard if I go back to my agency and do this. I don't think my colleagues are going to like it. But they don't really believe it. They're just having thoughts. That's okay. And they're way more likely to recommend a patient validated. And that effect is mediated by psychological flexibility and change in believability of the therapists. Help the therapist be more flexible. We have to do hard things. We're like undertakers or police or the military. We're therapists. We see pain all day long. Nobody comes to see me saying, I just wanted to stop in and let you know my life's going really well. What are your fees? And no, that doesn't happen. So if you're not flexible, you can't do the work in a way that isn't going to lead to your chronic distress. We're learning that all of this, I'm at my time, I'm about to take 2 minutes. Can I steal 2 to finish? Am I good? Okay. We're learning that this is linked to the underlying neurobiology and even some of the genetic and epigenetic work. It looks like, that 5-HTT serotonin transporter gene stuff on the 2 short alleles versus long alleles predicting depression. Turns out that's mediated through, it's an endophenotype is what they call it, but it's really mediation kind of finding through psychological flexibility. If you're inflexible, you're headed towards depression. If you're flexible, it has a different effect. And so I suggest this study by Andy Gloucester, and then the fMRI studies and stuff. I'm not going to show it because I don't have time, but there's changes in the underlying default network and so forth, very much like meditation if you're a neurobiological guy, based on acceptance and diffusion. Your attentional processes change, and that changes your underlying neurobiology. And then that makes it easier, and that's true also in pain, where it actually changes the connectivity around pain processing. In that study, really cool, they had chronic pain patients, did ACT, showed this change in the underlying neurobiology, were sort of left responsive to and focused on pain. Then they put them in thumb screws. We'll make pain. Something out of a torture apparatus practically. Same thing. People process pain differently. You ever looked at a horse who had a broken leg when they're distracted by something? I mean, they can walk around and go like, what? A football player when they have an energy and they're focused on the game. You know this, right? Your chronic pain patients are focused on the pain. That's different. It doesn't have to be like that. And we can help people, not get rid of the pain, but change how they interact with their own psychology in such a way that they're more able to step up to the challenge of living and loving even with pain, if they have pain. So here are my last 2 slides. Progress, I believe, in our field, all the applied fields, not just clinical, this is a little bit of a clinical focus, but all of our fields, if they're applied, requires a more process-focused account that's integrated with basic research, it's powerful, broadly applicable, and focused on changeable events. And I hope I've convinced you that the psychological flexibility model is that. But I hope I've also convinced you that quite beyond that maybe it's a model for whatever you care about, whatever models and theories you care about or processes you want to investigate, to do it in a way that has a chance to be fully understood. And I think the ACT, RFT, flexibility, CBS world has spent the time, has made the investment, and has a proud story to tell, but I hope it's now used in a way that spreads across all these different perspectives. And I'm working with my colleagues, Stefan Hoffman, for example, and I are doing a series of books on process-based CBT. He's not an ACT guy, he's a traditional Beckian CBT guy. Fine. You don't have to be an ACT guy. You can still care about a future in which we know the processes that are going on with a human being that we can change, that will liberate their lives. So that's my story, and I hope you enjoyed the talk. I don't know if we have time for questions, but thank you. You make the call. If there's time for questions, I'm happy to take them. Anybody have any? Yeah.
Yeah, so one of the takeaways that I'm getting from this is that in all contexts, psychological flexibility is a good thing. Insofar as that it improves outcomes for the clients, it improves effectiveness of the therapists. So on the therapist end, what's the first step towards improving one's own psychological flexibility?
Well, I would work on your own emotional openness and cognitive flexibility. Don't try to be right in your sessions. Try to be effective. Bring your theories and thoughts in there, but hold them in a little bit of space. You know, one of the things I say at my supervision team to my ACT people when I'm going through the ACT model is every once in a while I'll stop and I'll say, by the way, in the therapy room, don't believe any of this. Because the last thing you want to do is go in there and say, you're not accepting too enough. You need to not be so please, just shut up. If you ever want to say you shouldn't be so fused, point the finger at you. And so we have to hold these models, we have to care about these models passionately, but hold them lightly. Nobody's winning a Nobel Prize in psychology unless they're in economics or something. And I don't think it's going to happen anytime soon, so let's be humble about it. So that's one thing. I would, if you're going to do ACT training, if you come to a boot camp or something like that, it's going to be experiential. The early trainings are going to look at your psychology, your emotions, because you need to know how hard it is when you're asking another human being to walk into the hell of their own history. It's hard for you too. And so that humbles you, and you come down more in a horizontal relationship rather than a vertical one, where you're giving advice to people. So that's one. Just what I usually say is take a good self-help book, like Get Out of Your Mind Into Your Life. We've done randomized trials on that. That's my self-help ACT book. It does about 3/4 of what you do with a course of ACT if you do it thoroughly. If anybody gets $12, go to Amazon, or just send me a buck. You don't have to read the book. No, I changed my mind. Read the book. Skim it, set it aside. If it speaks to you, go back and read it slowly and do the exercises. If you bind up and you can't understand why you should do an exercise, skip it, but then come back and do it. If you do that, it'll take a month. And it'll get into your head, very likely. Either that or don't do ACT. If you don't resonate to ACT, don't do ACT. I've not met a good ACT therapist who doesn't know something about it on the inside. Same thing with the meditation folks. That's another thing. Just meditating would help. We know that part of what mediates the impact of meditation is psychological flexibility. They have pretty good new data on that. But one of the things you said was that we know psychological flexibility is always useful wherever you go. Actually, that's not quite true in this way. Like we have some data with early responders, that they need to distract themselves from the horror of what they're seeing when they're, how can I say this without grossing everybody out? But if you got brains on the street, probably that moment is not the time to cry. You with me on this? So don't even turn what I said into a hard and fast rule. I think psychological flexibility has to include context sensitivity. It's like the zebra in the Lions Park. So no, it takes something like the kind of stuff Marshall Linehan does with distraction, with borderline personality disorder. To me, that makes perfect sense. Because it's better to put your hand in ice water than it is to cut on yourself. And we'll deal with more emotional openness later. Let's start with, at least don't cut. Does this make sense to me? It's a trajectory. So don't turn even what I've said here into a hard and fast rule. You need to be more accepting, even to yourself. Sometimes it's okay just to distract and so forth, but over the long haul, psychological flexibility looks like it's better, and you're right, let's work on ourselves first. Any other questions anyone has? I won't hold you too long. If you're afraid that you're doomed if you ask a question, I'll try to be short. Yeah. Oh, you're so close.
What about targeting psychological flexibility in children? Have there been?
Yeah, there's about 15 randomized trials with children, chronic pain, anxiety problems, dealing with in developmentally disabled populations. So you can measure it. There's age-adjusted measures of psychological flexibility that work really well. They predict longitudinally and cross-sectionally, just like the adult measures do. Now, the methods are different. I'll give you an example. Okay, so I'm working with a client that has a lot of worries and fears, and so we have. I was working with a student to have say, well, imagine that this is a big river, and here we have a boat. Let's draw on the sails, all the things that come that you think when you. And so we had like little scary monsters driven up, and we would, practice letting the boats go down the river. You're probably not going to do that to a normal businessman. They think you're a little weird, but it's the same principle of learning to just kind of watch from a distance with a dispassionate curiosity. When you turn it into an object, children understand that. And so there's a lot of metaphors in ACT, but they're not abstract. They're almost all can be things you could act out. And in fact, there's ACT that looks like psychodrama. It's all acting out. And you can do that with kids. And so games, there are ACT games, literally board games. You can buy them, ACT board games. So we're figuring out how to reach these different populations. It's not a one-size-fits-all. The model may apply everywhere because it's about how language interacts with these older learning processes. That's basically what it's about. But the technology is different by problem, by age, by culture. We've been able, well, here's another example. I mentioned culture. IU is really important in perspective taking exercises that are inside ACT. Taking the perspective of another person, looking back at yourself, or imagining you being older, looking back at yourself now. Or when you were younger and suffering, what would you say to yourself if you had that same thought? That kind of thing, where you mess around with time, place, or person. If you're dealing with Asian cultures, it's not IU, it's we, they. You gotta know that. But fortunately, the theory, because it's so basic, isn't the theory about English language, it's a theory about language and cognition. So Japanese ACT looks different than US ACT. And Takashi Uto, who's the main ACT guy in Japan, his name, they have that characterological kind of language and stuff. If you literally translate his name for ACT, it means deep, slow-moving river. Nobody in here is not Japanese could do that. You just wouldn't know how to make, so it has to fit age, culture, problem, and that requires a lot of work with a lot of people. Fortunately, there's a lot of people involved in the work, and people can take ownership of it. I don't let anybody say that I'm the founder of ACT. You can't do it. I won't let it be written down. Did I start it? Just between you and me, I was the first, but it's not right because we're all developing it together, alive right now. And so it just seems weird to say it that way. So the community is in control of ACT and is developing it. I'll take one more if you have it, because I don't want to abuse my privilege, even though I love being up here and answering questions. Holding forth feeds my narcissism, as my wife would say. Yeah, one more, and then we're going to...
Have you looked at it head-to-head with psychotropics?
Yeah, there's about 6 trials of ACT compared to psychotropic medication. Some of them are combos, and some of them are head-to-heads. So, for example, I did a study with bupropion for smoking, plus the normal counseling that you're supposed to get, which, by the way, nobody does get. It's in the little flyers. And by the way, if you don't know this, those medications were only approved by the FDA because they were combined with counseling. But the way they're scripted, here's the script, go home, take the meds, which has never been tested successfully in a study. And in fact, the closest to it was a study we did where we actually eliminated any of the normal kind of support in our study and had just the pill, and the quit rates went down by more than a half. So there's some BS going on inside big pharma. Go figure. This is not a surprise to you, right? But what we found there is that we could significantly increase the quit rates. And then there's now 7 randomized trials in the area of smoking. And that's a cool one because our overall effect size is now with about 3,000, 4,000 patients, is about 50% greater quit rates at 1 year follow-up. Interestingly, it's at 1 year follow-up, but not necessarily at 6 months. And here's why. People slip, but with ACT they come back. When you slip on medications with smoking, you're gone. You're not coming back. We say this to our addiction folks, ACT. We take the fun out of addiction. Because if you're mindfully addicted, it's not as fun anymore. You're not fully avoiding if you go into drugs with your eyes open, right? So we've seen this in diet, exercise, and smoking and substance use more generally. ACT versus antidepressants, there's 2 studies. I think there is a role for medications. I told you about a randomized trial we did to help drug and alcohol counselors actually help people use medications, right? Because there's a place for medications, but it's not big dose forever. Big dose forever is, you just look at the black box warnings on our freaking antidepressants. Oh, by the way, your suicidality can go up. What? Because it's not an antidepressant. It's not an antidepressant. That's a marketing name that came later. It's like antipsychotic. They're not antipsychotic. They're the old name of major tranquilizers is what they are. But, so I really want good science, and I want penetration of the blind control for, and I want active placebos, but smaller dose, shorter course, linked to psychosocial. Can I abuse you for 1 more minute? Most of you believe that combined is better. Medications plus psychosocial is better. You've been told that. Ask this. Okay, combined, psychotherapy, drug, placebo. What group is missing? You have 4 groups, there's a group missing. You should never do that study. Never do that study. Placebo, medication, psychotherapy, combination of psychotherapy and medications. Placebo and therapy? No, it's placebo and medication. Excuse me, you're right, placebo and therapy, of course, that's exactly what it is. I had a break. I'm an old man. I'm 69, I got well, you got it right. This, David Barlow did that beta memory study, compared to his methods with panic disorder, and the person who pushed that in was a psychiatrist who just lay on the ground and insisted that it be in there. And here's what was found. Both psychotherapy and the antidepressant are better than the placebo. The combination is better than either one. The placebo plus the psychotherapy was just as good as the combination. Which tells you it wasn't the active treatment of the medication. It was the placebo effect of the medication. So the Big Pharma doesn't do it until the FDA requires it. They won't, because it will blow up. Well, this is the FDA pull down of by Kirsch's work, where they looked at the entire FDA database on antidepressants. When you have active controls in there, the effect sizes go down to arguably are close to 0. I mean, they're maybe 10% for the most severe. So it really makes you worried. If you heard me say medications are bad in that sentence, please erase that part. I didn't say that. I didn't mean that. I'm just saying we want good science. We're fighting a multi-billion-dollar industry that doesn't want to give us good science. Because they make money on bad science. They do. Doesn't mean that's all bad science, but you've got to be able to distinguish good and bad by having proper controls. And so I would like to see the day happen when I could really answer your question to the nines, and when they've funded the kind of studies we're going to need to do that. Well, I have abused your time too much, but thank you for the attention. I hope I've been useful to you.
Thank you, Dr. Hayes. Again, there'll be some light refreshments outside. If I have